A single overhead lamp flickered above the deserted train platform. The wind, chilling and sharp as broken glass, whipped through the empty station. The clock overhead ticked ominously, its hands creeping toward midnight. There was no announcement, no bustle of fellow travelers, only silence, illuminated by a sickly, flickering light. When the clock struck 12, the train slid into view without a single shriek of metal. It was as though it materialized out of thin air. Jonah stood with his ticket in hand, feeling the delicate paper trembling between his fingers. It was stamped with no departure time, just an embossed image of a soaring raven. He hesitated, feeling a cold press of dread behind his eyes, as though some part of him recognized the impossibility of a train arriving at midnight on this abandoned line. And yet, the doors slid open with a hiss, and a voice inside him compelled him to board. The interior was warmly lit but eerily silent. Rows of plush seats stretched along both sides of the aisle, their upholstery the color of dried blood. Jonah took a tentative step forward, scanning for any sign of other passengers. He felt certain he wasn't alone. There was a hush and tension in the air that could only come when multiple hearts beat in secrecy. He set his hand against one of the seats, testing its solidity, and sat down. Outside, the train station vanished under a swirling darkness. He heard footsteps down the aisle. A conductor emerged from the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. His pale eyes were unreadable, his face a mask of serene detachment. Without looking at Jonah, he wandered across the carriage, as if searching for something. When at last he looked in Jonah's direction, his gaze was sharp enough to make Jonah's throat tighten. "Ticket, please," the conductor requested in a soft voice. Jonah handed over the slip, noticing the faint tremor in his own wrist. The conductor gave it a cursory glance, then returned it. A faint whisper of a smile tugged at his lips. "I see," he said cryptically, before moving along. Jonah watched him disappear into the next car, the doors sliding shut behind him with a quiet click. Only then did Jonah realize he was not alone in the carriage. An older woman, her face etched with worry, sat near the windows, twisting her hands in the folds of a faded coat. Down the aisle, a man in a rumpled shirt stared ahead with haunted eyes. Across the aisle, a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks bit her lower lip, as though stifling a scream. Their gazes seemed to drift through the space, coming to rest on Jonah, as if silently acknowledging yet another troubled soul dragged aboard. The train lurched into motion. The lights overhead flickered in unison with the stuttering wheels. Jonah's stomach twisted in tight knots. This was not a normal journey. Something in the stale, heavy air told him that each person here had come searching for something, or perhaps trying to flee from something. He tried to recall how he'd gotten his own ticket. It felt like a fever dream. Rummaging through an old family trunk, coming across an envelope addressed to him in handwriting he recognized as his late mother's. Inside was that single curious ticket. He hadn't given it much thought until the compulsion seized him that night, pulling him here against all common sense. The carriage outside the windows was drenched in darkness. It was impossible to see if the landscape was city or countryside, only an endless void. The hush felt supernatural, as though the train existed in a world divorced from all reality. Jonah turned to the older woman, offering a small nod. She nodded back. In her dry, quavering voice, she introduced herself as Miriam. She explained in guarded sentences that she had boarded the train hoping for a chance to atone for something. "I lost my grandson years ago," she said, voice trembling. "Never could forgive myself. I let him out of my sight, just for a moment." Her eyes glistened with tears. "They told me, well, I heard about this train, whispered about it in nursing homes and among people with regrets, said it offered a chance to set things right." He felt a subtle shift in the train's speed, a deceleration that was slight enough to be almost indiscernible. Through the window, faint lights emerged, indicating a station. It looked abandoned and half-ruined, the platform overgrown with weeds. There shouldn't have been time or space for a stop. Jonah was sure they had only just left. Nevertheless, with a jarring swerve, the train came to a full stop. Doors sliding open onto a deserted platform, barely lit by a single flickering lamp. A chaotic swirl of guilt-ridden tension hung in the air. None of the passengers spoke, but Jonah felt their desperation. Slowly, an older man stepped out from a different carriage and onto the station, as if compelled. He wore a ragged coat. His eyes were glassy and unseeing. He walked away from the lights, dissolving into the darkness beyond, disappearing without so much as a farewell. Then, with abrupt finality, the train's doors glided shut, and the locomotive lurched into motion again. Jonah strained to see what had become of him. Was that man free? Had he found peace out there? Or was he consumed by something worse? The question hung heavily, casting an even more foreboding mood around the other passengers. Time became fluid. Minutes passed like hours, and sometimes entire stretches of the ride blurred in Jonah's perception. He dozed, or thought he did, only to be jolted awake by a shift in the train's motion. The next time he opened his eyes, someone else had shown up in the carriage, a middle-aged woman with mascara smudged beneath her eyes, clutching a bundle of letters to her chest as though they might vanish at any moment. Jonah tried to distract himself by examining the windows. They were now opaque, reflecting only the interior of the carriage like a mirror, and in that reflection, he noticed the conductor standing behind him. That figure had a way of appearing without the slightest warning. He nearly gasped at the image but steadied himself and turned around slowly. "You're searching for forgiveness," the conductor said in a voice like a quiet rumor. "But guilt burdens the soul in funny ways, doesn't it?" Jonah froze, weighed down by secrets he had tried to bury. He thought back to the day he lost his temper and stormed out on his mother. She had been gravely ill, nerves frayed. He told himself he'd return, apologize, but he waited too long. The hospital called him. She was gone. The memory pricked him with regret so fierce he could hardly breathe. The conductor simply nodded, stepping away as if he were reading Jonah's mind. The train lights flickered again, and when they stabilized, Jonah was alone in the carriage except for the older woman, Miriam, who looked equally spooked. The rest of the seats were empty. Neither knew how nor when the other passengers had vanished. The sense of being stranded in a twilight realm pressed upon them. "Where?" Jonah struggled to form a coherent question. Miriam shook her head, misery plain on her face. She clenched the lapels of her coat, knuckles whitening. "I've tried to get off," she whispered. "The doors won't open for me." Tears threatened to fall again. "I wanted to see if I could find my grandson. I thought, maybe if I apologized at the right station, maybe he would appear." She gave a shuddering sigh. "I missed my chance when I first boarded. The door opened. I thought I saw him, but I was too afraid to leave the train. Now I can't leave, no matter how hard I try." Jonah's heart sank. He glanced at the window and saw that the reflection was gone, replaced by swirling darkness again. One by one, overhead lights dimmed, currently leaving only 2 or 3 flickering bulbs. He stood, his skin crawling, and ventured to the end of the carriage. He pressed the door panels that should lead to the next car. They slid open slowly, releasing a chill so sharp it made his breath mist. The adjacent carriage was dimmer, narrower. The seats were arranged in bizarre angles, as though rearranged by someone who had never ridden a train. He saw a man hunched over in the far corner, shoulders shaking. It was the rumpled shirt passenger Jonah had noticed earlier. The man looked up, green eyes shining with terror. There was a band of sweat across his brow. "Who are you?" he asked in a trembling voice. "My name is Jonah," he answered. "Are you all right?" The man let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Do I look all right?" He pressed his hands to his face. "I've seen things. People I wronged. They were in this carriage. An ex-partner. An old employee I fired unfairly. My father. And they were speaking all at once, condemning me. Their voices wouldn't stop. Then, just like that, he snapped his fingers. Gone. I boarded this train hoping for absolution. I messed up my entire life. But each time I think I'm at the threshold of forgiveness, I only find more punishment." Jonah could only nod in sympathy. He noticed how the seats in this carriage seemed to shift slightly in the corner of his vision, like the world was in a state of constant flux. He half expected the walls to melt and reveal an underworld behind them. He felt compelled to keep moving, searching for some clue as to how to stop this nightmare. He encouraged the trembling passenger to join him, offering a shaky vow of mutual support. They moved to the next carriage, finding more compartments in dim half-light, and again the accusing hush. This time, an empty seat held a tiny, battered teddy bear. The presence of the toy sent a wave of sorrow through Jonah, stirring old regrets. Like a rotting refrain, the train again slowed. Another impossible station loomed in the darkness outside. The air in the carriage crackled with the tension of unspoken decisions. Would any of them try to disembark here, or did they fear the unknown more than the train? The doors slid open with a hiss. Outside, broken glass littered the platform, and the sign that should have read the station's name was shattered. Jonah thought he heard a child's laughter echoing from the corridor, but when he strained to hear more, the sound faded. Miriam, who had followed them timidly, gasped. She stood on quaking legs, drifting involuntarily toward the open door. She turned back to Jonah with a sudden determination in her eyes. "I have to see," she managed, voice trembling yet resolute. "I can't let the chance slip by again." Jonah wanted to protest, but she stepped through the doorway. He and the rumpled shirt man hurried forward, calling for her. They saw her take one tentative step onto the platform. She clutched the teddy bear, tears streaming down her face. The lights outside flickered, and Jonah caught a glimpse of a small boy standing at the far edge of the platform, partially hidden by shadow. Miriam called out the name of her grandson. The silence continued. Then the boy vanished, swallowed by darkness, leaving Miriam to crumple with heartbreak. Jonah and the trembling passenger tried to help her back inside the train, but the moment they turned to re-enter, the train's doors began to slide shut. With a burst of desperate energy, Jonah hurled his shoulder against them. There was a metallic shriek as the doors fought him, as though possessed of a will to remain closed. At the last second, he forced them open just enough for the three of them to slip back in. Then they slammed shut, leaving the station behind. Huddled together in the dim corridor, they questioned how many more stops they would encounter. And what about the other passengers? Where were they? What unspeakable illusions might be unraveling for them in other parts of the train? Jonah felt something shift underfoot. The floor was no longer made of the same polished material. It felt spongy, uneven. The lights swayed. Their surroundings seemed to ripple, and the train lurched violently as though it had jumped its rails. The overhead lights dimmed until they were almost extinguished. Before Jonah could gather his senses, the conductor's deep voice echoed from behind them. "You must confront your guilt," he said. "This is the fare you pay here." The conductor's eyes bored into Jonah's, then flicked to the trembling man, then to Miriam. "Only those who truly understand the weight of their sins can move on." "Move on to what?" Jonah spat, exhaustion fueling his anger. "Forgiveness? Or something worse?" The conductor offered no direct answer. His thin lips curved in a solemn expression that might have been pity or perhaps faint amusement. At that moment, the train gave way to complete darkness. All lights extinguished, and Jonah found himself plunged into a disorienting black void. He could hear trembling breaths from Miriam and the other man, but the train was silent otherwise. Then, faint shapes and shadows began to swirl around them. A projection of memory, perhaps. The smell of antiseptic pricked his nose. The beep of a heart monitor echoed faintly, but there was no sign of the staff. Instead, a voice hissed through the gloom, repeating the words his mother had once said when he stormed out. "I'm sorry I couldn't be the parent you needed." The memory jarred him so hard that tears stung his eyes. Regret rose in his throat like bile. Then the hospital scene shattered, replaced by another vision. This time, Jonah stood in his childhood living room, the easy chair empty, the television flickering with static. His mother's voice echoed in the emptiness. "You can't keep leaving me like this." For a heartbeat, he heard his own voice responding with teenage venom. "I can do what I want." The memory cut deeper for having been left unresolved. Jonah sank to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears, but the voices echoed louder inside his mind. He could only guess that Miriam and the other passenger were trapped in their own illusions, because their whimpers of despair mingled with his own. In the gloom, everything began collapsing inward. as if the train itself were a living entity, feeding on their guilt. Lights sputtered on again with a sharp crackle. The illusions dissipated, revealing the train corridor. Though now the seats were in complete disarray, some turned on their sides, others stacked at precarious angles. At the far end, the conductor stood as though waiting. Jonah mustered his courage and approached him. "Tell me how to atone," he pleaded. "I can't stay here forever. I regret what I did. How can I make it right?" The conductor's solemn gaze fell on Jonah. "The train accepts those who long to release their guilt, but cannot find the path. It's a place of reflection, of punishment, and sometimes redemption. But redemption has its cost." He gestured to the next carriage. "The final stop awaits beyond that door. Whether you find absolution depends on what you do when you arrive." Jonah swallowed, heart pounding. He turned to Miriam and the rumpled shirt man, both looking frail yet determined. Together, they traversed the toppled seats and approached the next carriage door. When it slid open, a suffocating darkness loomed on the other side. Taking cautious steps, they passed through. They emerged into a single long corridor without seats, a narrow space with walls the color of dried blood. At the far end of this chamber stood a lone door. Emitting a faint glow, it pulsed slowly, as though a gigantic, unearthly heart beat behind it. With each throb of light, Jonah's chest constricted in empathy, feeling a kind of magnetic pull. The trembling passenger began to hyperventilate. "I don't want to do this," he rasped, stepping backward. Miriam clutched his arm and guided him forward gently. "We need to see this through," she whispered. "It's our only chance." Each step closer to the door heightened Jonah's dread. He felt the memory of every wrong word, every cowardly action, every betrayal he had committed. A part of him wondered if death would be a mercy compared to the mental anguish intensifying in that hallway. At last they reached the door, and Jonah gripped the handle. It felt alive, blazing hot with a surge of energy that bordered on painful. He pushed it open. A vast emptiness greeted them on the other side, a shape suspended in pale moonlight. It seemed to be an open platform, perhaps the last car of the train, where they could see the swirling darkness below, above, and on all sides, as though they were traveling through a boundless cosmos devoid of stars. In the middle stood a series of large mirrors forming a circle. Each mirror seemed to ripple like water, distorting the reflections into ghostly shapes. The conductor's voice resonated behind them, though his figure was nowhere in sight. "Step forward, put your sins on display, see if your soul can bear the weight." Hesitant, they moved toward the mirrors. Jonah found himself standing before one that displayed an image of his mother. She lay in the hospital bed, turning to meet Jonah's gaze through the smooth glass. Then the reflection dissolved and he saw himself, older and burdened with regret. The reflection spoke without moving its lips. "Why did you never return to say goodbye? All she ever wanted was your presence. You abandoned her." He pressed a trembling hand to the mirror, whispering a tearful apology. In that moment, a surge of heat raced through his fingers. He felt something inside him break, tear open. At first he thought it was the start of monstrous punishment, but then a subtle wave of relief washed over him. He realized tearfully he was saying all the things he should have said years ago. How sorry he was, how much he loved her, that he wished he could turn back time. Miriam stood before a different mirror, murmuring apologies to the child in the glass. The rumor of a gentle boy's laughter floated across the platform. The rumpled shirt man confronted a parade of faces. Each one demanded contrition for the harm he'd done, and he tried to respond with trembling honesty. The air on the platform began to glow with a faint luminescence, as if the swirling cosmos around them were absorbing their confessions. Jonah's tears fell freely, his spirit heaving with the intensity of his release. For a fraction of a moment, he felt lighter, as though true forgiveness might be within reach. Then he heard a screech from one of the mirrors behind him, a writhing sound that made his heart lurch. In a mirror to Jonah's left, a black shape crawled out, manifesting first as a hand, elongated and skeletal, soon joined by a twisted face. The shape hissed and moaned, and Jonah realized that for every ounce of guilt the passengers released, The mirrored world weakened enough to let in nightmare. He yelled for the others to stay back, but a swirl of swirling black limbs erupted, forming a cluster of torment made tangible. Miriam screamed as the shape lunged toward her. She stumbled, nearly losing her grip on the teddy bear. The trembling passenger tried to pull her away, but another black figure emerged from his mirror, latching onto his shoulders with an inky claw. Jonah clung to the frantic notion that maybe this was the final test, to face the darkest parts of themselves. Summoning courage, he dragged his attention away from the horrifying shapes and instead looked into his mirror again. He focused on the image of his mother, repeating his apologies, pouring out every speck of contrition and remorse. He had never done this properly in life. Here, in this confessional space, he bared all shame. A shimmering glow spread across the surface of his mirror. The dark shape reaching for Jonah shrieked in fury, as though repelled by that light. He heard Miriam sobbing and turned to see she was embracing the teddy bear, confessing her sorrow and heartbreak to the ephemeral reflection of her grandson. The shape attacking her withered and pulled away, screeching. The trembling passenger stood groaning, trying to voice his regrets before multiple spectral apparitions. Slowly, painfully, he choked out the words, and each time he did, a piece of the nightmare peeled away. Eventually, a light so brilliant it flooded the entire platform, erupted from the circle of mirrors. The inky shapes dissolved into swirling tendrils of darkness, dissipating in anguished howls. Jonah shielded his eyes, tears streaking his cheeks. The only sound was the thrumming of his own heartbeat. When he opened his eyes, the train was still. The final platform seemed illuminated by a dawn sky, pale pink and gold. The violent swirl of shadows had vanished, replaced by a hush of possibility. The door to the next corridor stood open, revealing what looked like a real station on a clear morning. Could it really be morning? Jonah held his breath, half expecting the conductor to appear and stop them, but the corridor was empty, no sign of that tall, silent figure. Miriam lifted the teddy bear, tears still on her face, but her posture straighter. The rumpled shirt man looked exhausted and relieved, as though he had run a marathon of confession. "We can leave," Jonah said, voice tight with what he hoped was truth. The others nodded in cautious agreement. Stepping off the train felt like crossing the threshold of a dream back into something resembling the real world. They found themselves on a quiet platform with a single bench and a ticket counter. The morning sky glowed overhead, gently warming the chill of night away. Birds sang in the distance, and there was no sign of that swirling darkness. Relief and sadness mingled in Jonah's chest. He felt a surge of grief for the mother he would never again see in life. But maybe she heard him out there, wherever she was. He turned to look at the train behind them. Its windows were dark, no sign of life within. Then, slowly, as if it existed on a different plane of time, the train glided away from the platform without a sound. He saw a fleeting flash of the conductor's pale face in a window, eyes glinting with something that might have been approval or sorrow. Jonah couldn't be sure. The train disappeared around a bend, leaving the three of them standing in a new and gentle silence. They exchanged tentative glances and realized that while guilt could never be fully erased, something had shifted. The burden they each carried had lightened, replaced by the faint hope that even a shattered life can rebuild. That the living can still make amends to the dead in small ways, by living with humility and compassion. A passing breeze ruffled Jonah's hair. He remembered the final words he said to his mother in that confessional space, the promise to forgive himself. Miriam clung to the teddy bear, as though it were a lifeline, and the passenger with the rumpled shirt exhaled in relief. No one said anything for a while. They simply listened to the breeze, grateful for its soft presence. Gradually, the sun inched higher, warming their faces with light. They didn't speak about where they would go next, nor did they say what their futures held, but they understood that stepping off that train was no guaranteed reprieve. The final cost of traveling such a route was the acceptance of their own failings. How they would live with that weight was up to them. But for the first time in a long time, Jonah felt the faint glow of possibility. Somewhere in the far distance, faint as a whisper, sounded the faint clang of a departing train bell. He wondered how many lost souls stood on a deserted platform tonight, clutching uncanny tickets, searching for a forgiveness they could not name. How many would board, drawn by the promise of absolution, only to face the harrowing torment inside? Jonah bowed his head. The rumpled shirt man set a tentative hand on his shoulder, and Miriam, tears glistening, offered him a gentle nod. Together, the three walked away from the station. Overhead, the sun rose on a horizon that felt both new and terribly familiar, bathing the world in a promise that life, no matter how tarnished, would go on, changed by confession and perhaps tentatively redeemed.